catch me howling at the moon.
What's up, guys, and welcome back to Park Pros. Man, it feels good to say that again. So you might not have noticed, but I haven't posted a video in a while. There were a few reasons for that, which I talked about in my community post a couple weeks ago. But probably the biggest reason was the fact that I just straight up ran out of content. The virus canceled the spring trips I had to Florida and Texas, and I basically used up all the B-roll that I had from last season. But then I randomly decided to go on this 10-day, 9-park road trip in late August, and I legit probably got a half year's worth of content. I have a bunch of really strong opinions on the parks and coasters from that trip, as well as from a couple other parks that I visited this year. So I'm excited to share those with you guys and get back to a more regular upload schedule. So the purpose of this video is kind of twofold. First, to give you guys a little bit of an update of what parks I've been hitting and a little lens into what kinds of videos are coming up on the channel going forward. And second, I want to give you guys some insights into my thought process when planning a 10-day road trip that focused exclusively on getting to as many open parks and coasters as I could. So with that little channel update out of the way, let's jump right into it. There are a number of factors that go into planning an extensive coaster-focused road trip. Airtime Thrills made a great video a few months ago which goes more in depth than this one will, but I'm going to try to cover all the major things you need to consider when planning something like this. The first thing I had to research and keep in mind, which is hopefully only the case in 2020, is which parks are actually open. A lot of parks across the country didn't open at all in 2020, which added an extra obstacle when planning this trip. The idea for this trip was originally going to be driving south of Tennessee first for Dollywood, over to Carowinds, up to Virginia for Busch Gardens and Kings Dominion, DC for Six Flags America, and then finishing up in Pennsylvania with Hershey and Knoebels before heading to Indiana for Hollywood Nights. Two major parks on that trip, Carowinds and Kings Dominion, never even opened in 2020, and Busch Gardens didn't open back up until a few weeks before my trip, so I had to make an audible to that plan. Instead, I opted to make this a Pennsylvania and New Jersey-centric trip, because almost all the major parks in those two states were open. And even though I had been to most of the main parks on this trip, like Cedar Point, Great Adventure, Hershey, I hadn't been back in quite a few years. Another important thing to consider when planning a trip like this is really what you want to get out of it. For many coaster enthusiasts, getting as many new credits as possible on a trip is the priority. For me though, I always value quality over quantity, and I'd much rather spend my time on the road riding a few really good coasters than a ton of very average coasters. I easily could have fit in a handful of smaller parks, and realistically probably could have added 10 to 20 more credits on this trip if I really wanted to. But I much prefer to spend full days at bigger parks rather than scrambling around to FECs and smaller parks to pick up credits. These are the types of decisions you have to make in the planning phase of a trip. For example, I slotted out one night of my trip to knock out some of the pier parks on the Jersey coast. I know I definitely wanted to hit Playland's Castaway Cove in Ocean City to ride Gale Force, but then my decision came down to either going to Casino Pier, which has a great Eurofighter called Hydrus, or Maury's Piers, which had almost twice the amount of credits as Casino Pier, but their headlining coaster, Great White, was closed. I ultimately chose to go to Casino Pier because I just thought that Hydrus looked better than what Maury's had to offer at the time. When you have a limited amount of time in places like Pennsylvania and New Jersey that have so many parks and coasters to offer, these are the kind of trade-offs you have to consider. Other people might also add in days to do other things like checking out major cities or seeing historical landmarks, but that all comes down to how much time you have and your own personal preference. On this trip, my focus was packing in as many great parks and coasters as I could in the 10 days that I had. So my shortlist was mostly consisted of the major mainstream parks in the area. So that was the basic framework of planning the trip. Now let's talk about some of the technical things that I had to work around. Since I was doing this trip in late August, a few of the parks that I wanted to hit, namely Kennywood and Dorney, were only operating during the weekends. Since the second weekend of my trip was already occupied by Hollywood Nights at Holiday World, I had to knock out both these parks in the first weekend. The rest of the parks had daily operation, so after knocking out Kennywood on Saturday and Dorney on Sunday, I just planned a route that made the most sense for the remaining parks that were on my short list. When planning out a trip like this, there's a few things that you need to consider in terms of timing. The first is your ability to drive long distances, especially right after a full day at a park. The majority of days on this trip, especially at the beginning, I was driving for multiple hours after park closed to get to the next day's park. For example, I drove 3 hours to Pittsburgh after staying at Cedar Point until close, and then the next day drove 4.5 hours to Allentown after a long day at Kennywood. Doing that day after day can really wear you out, so I made sure to build in times during the week where I could just chill at my hotel for a while. Another thing to consider is the margin of error that you're leaving for yourself. If you're planning on hitting a new park every day with no breaks, that means if something unfortunate happens, like a park being rained out or a signature coaster is closed the day you're there, you kinda just have to bite the bullet if you don't want to throw off the rest of your schedule. However, if you're willing to keep your schedule more flexible, it might be a good idea to build in a safety day in case of a rainout or another unforeseen circumstance. I had a couple minor unfortunate things happen on this trip, which you'll hear about in my upcoming videos, but luckily didn't have to deal with any crappy weather, and I only suffered one major unexpected coaster closure, so for the most part everything went just as planned. Ideally, you'd want to do a trip like this with as many people as possible to break up the gas and hotel costs, but since I finalized the details for this trip only a few days before I left, I decided it was just easier to do it solo, which wasn't a bad thing at all, as I ended up meeting up with a bunch of enthusiasts, some who I had known beforehand and a few who DM'd me on Instagram. In terms of lodging, I stayed at hotels every night of this trip, and there's two sites that I would recommend for that, hotels.com and Priceline. Hotels.com usually has pretty solid rates and listings and is always a reliable option it seems like, plus you get your 10th booking for free. I also like Priceline because they have this express deal option where they'll give you a general location and star rating of a hotel, but not the actual name until you book it, which gives you a pretty nice discount for solid hotels. I didn't book any hotels more than a few hours in advance of when I arrived that night, and these two sites were always reliable for me and pretty cost effective. So let me walk you through a high level view of what this road trip ended up being, with some visuals from my Instagram story from that week. I kicked off the trip on Thursday night with a 4.5-hour drive from Chicago to Sandusky. Cedar Point wasn't originally on my trip itinerary, but I decided to leave a day earlier than planned so I could spend an afternoon at the park. After working a half day on Friday, I got to Cedar Point around 1:30 and stayed till close. After a quick Taco Bell run, I drove 3 hours to Pittsburgh and got to Kennywood for park opening the next day. I left Kennywood a few hours before close on Saturday because I had a 4.5-hour cross Pennsylvania drive to Allentown for Dorney Park the next day. After a full day at Dorney on Sunday, I drove an hour and a half to my hotel in West Jersey. On Monday I worked from my hotel room and then around 6 p.m. headed to the Jersey coast for a few hours at Playland's Castaway Cove in Ocean City. From there, I booked it up an hour and 15 minutes north to get to Seaside Heights for the last hour that Casino Pier was open. On Tuesday, I was at Great Adventure from open to close and then drove 2 hours to Hershey where my hotel was for the next 2 nights. Wednesday morning, I drove the hour and a half from Hershey to Ellisburg where I spent the day at Knoebels. On Thursday, I was at Hershey from open to close and then started driving as far west as I could, as I needed to drive the 10 hours between Hershey and Holiday World before the beginning of Hollywood Nights on Friday night. I ended up making it about 6 hours to Columbus on Thursday night, and finished the final 4 hours of the drive to Holiday World on Friday afternoon. I spent the weekend at Hollywood Nights, and on Sunday morning made the 5-hour drive back home to Chicago. Overall, the trip spanned 10 days, 9 parks, and around 2,200 miles driven. I got to experience 5 new parks, added 27 new credits, and was able to revisit a few of my top parks and favorite coasters. And while the actual trip was pretty far from what I had originally planned, sometimes you just have to improvise as an enthusiast, especially in 2020. Planning a trip like this really isn't too hard, it just takes a little bit of research and creativity. And once you get a hold of the overall logistics, you can really make it whatever you want it to be. After being cooped up for most of the prime months of the coaster season, it was really nice to go on a trip like this, get a chance to explore some new parks, and get a sense of normalcy back. And like I said, I have a ton of fresh new content and pretty interesting opinions that I can't wait to share with you guys in upcoming videos. With that being said, if you guys are new to the channel, be sure to drop a sub so you don't miss out on any of the new exciting content coming up. Thank you guys for checking out the video, and we'll see you all next time.